regardless of what it might mean, I always, this is my favorite Sunday of the year, at least every Sunday, the first Sunday of the quarter. I love starting a new study. Not that I don't like the rest of the study, but I love starting one. I don't know why, but something refreshing about the new study, especially whenever we get into a book like Esther, because Esther is a special book. It is unique in some ways. There is one particular thing for you stat nerds. I don't know if any of you are stat nerds. I like a good stat. Does anybody know what the book of Esther, I mean, there could be many right answers to this, what its peculiar trait is that it's known for, maybe more than anything else?
The only book of the Bible that mentions God.
Okay, yeah. It is the only book of the 66 books of the Bible that never mentions God. In fact, usually we say he doesn't mention the name of God. It's even more specific than that. It doesn't mention God at all, not just his name, Jehovah, Yahweh, but it doesn't even mention God, not once. And that's strange from our perspective. I, for one, believe that was all by the design of the Holy Spirit. It was intentionally built into the purpose of this book. Last week, in our last lesson of the Godhead and the Holy Spirit, we saw him as the one who inspired, who breathed out the Scriptures. Well, I believe it was all by the design of the Holy Spirit in the makeup of this book that is, in essence, a purely historical book, just like many of the Old Testament, some of the Old Testament books are. It would be in the history subcategory, but I believe that the Holy Spirit intentionally withheld the name of God and the word God from the book, because that alone adds another lesson that we'll learn from the book of Esther. Before we even get in, we've already learned a lesson. Yep?
Even though it doesn't mention God, yet we see that God's influence was throughout that Bible because of
yeah. That's the thing. That is the lesson.
Yeah.
That he's not mentioned. So in a way, we would say, we don't see God in the book of Esther at all, in one sense. Because literally we don't see the word God, and yet you see God. God is in every single part of it. God is working. And that is the lesson, in my opinion at least, for the absence of God in the book. The word God, or the mention of God, is just like today. We don't see God. None of us are seeing God. In fact, the Scriptures themselves say no man has ever seen God. And yet we know that He's everywhere and He's working. That is a wonderful takeaway from the book of Esther as a whole. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves, and it's worthy of that's a worthy note. I always like to bring that up anytime the book of Esther is discussed, because that is the number one memorable characteristic of the book of Esther, is that it's the only book that doesn't mention God at all. But we have to look at a little bit of background to understand the context here. Context is important, especially when you're diving into history, because we're sort of just diving right into a certain portion of Israel's history that we have to know what is going on. So around this time, or generally speaking, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, the southern kingdom of Judah, fell to the Babylonians around 586 BC. That was after the northern kingdom had already been demolished by the Assyrians. Then in that meantime, the Babylonians took over the Assyrians, so now the Assyrians no longer are a superpower. The Babylonians are the superpower, and about 100 to 150 years after the northern kingdom fell, the southern kingdom fell. That was a huge portion of Jeremiah's ministry, trying to warn the people, if we don't change, if we don't do something, we're doomed. And they didn't listen. Finally, here comes Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and they take Jerusalem about 586 BC. And like I said, Jeremiah, some of the other prophets were telling them over and over and over, if we don't repent of the wickedness that's going on, we're going to pay the consequences of this sin. And the people didn't listen. Just like God told Jeremiah they wouldn't listen, they didn't listen. And so Jeremiah announced what was going to happen more specifically. In Jeremiah 25, verses 8 and 9, he said, "Thus says Jehovah of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares Jehovah, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction, and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation." That was God's declaration, at least in that place. A very important verse, because God calls Nebuchadnezzar his own servant. Yeah. I will call or send for all the tribes of the north. That's where Babylon, we'll see a map in just a second. Babylon, or Babylonia rather, the city was called Babylon, but the nation, I guess for lack of a better word, was called Babylonia. It was north of Israel. And so he's saying, I'm bringing the people from the north, I'm bringing them here. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is my servant. And they're going to come here and destroy and make you pay for your wickedness. And then he added that in verse 11, that the nation will be taken captive and serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So that was Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years. Naturally, you can understand why some of the people of Israel that were rebellious did not like that prophecy. It's not a popular prophecy. We're going to be destroyed and taken captive for 70 years to the disgusting heathen king of Babylon. And you expect us to think God is saying that? Well, yeah, he did expect them to believe that, because God was saying that. Dean, do you have something?
I feel even though they were taken captive, we know that God was still with few of the ones, because we know Daniel and Meshach and
Yeah.
So God, as long as there were some of the children of Israel that God, as long as you believe in God, God still took care of them.
Yeah.
Even though he let, like you said, that Nebuchadnezzar was God's servant. Even though Nebuchadnezzar didn't believe in God, yet he served God.
Yeah, he just didn't know it.
He didn't know it, but he was serving God.
And God, I mean, he even specified that he doesn't know he's doing my will. He thinks he's doing he's doing Nebuchadnezzar's will, as far as Nebuchadnezzar is concerned. In other words, God didn't visit Nebuchadnezzar the way he visited Jeremiah and tell Nebuchadnezzar, hey, I got a job for you to do. I want you to go to Jerusalem and storm the city. No, Nebuchadnezzar was ignorant of God's bigger plan. Yeah, Dave?
Was there in history like four empires, Persia, Babylon, and then Greece, the next one?
It was in that prophecy in Daniel, Babylonia were the current kings. So they were the first one. Assyria technically came before them, but as far as when that prophecy was made, that had already happened. So Babylon, and then Persia, the Medes and the Persians, and then Greece was the third after. And then the Romans were the fourth. Yep. Yep. One, just like dominoes, one after the other. That's history 101, kind of. I mean, here's the superpower. Egypt, you go back far enough, it was Egypt. In biblical history and in human history, I guess. Then God sort of squashed them like a bug, and they never rose up the same again. But at this time, it's Babylonia. 70 years he predicted, he prophesied. And just as he prophesied, that's exactly what happened. 2 Chronicles 36, 17, and 18, here it comes. Just like Jeremiah said, the people didn't listen. And it says that the individuals who did not die when Jerusalem was overrun became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. That's 2 Chronicles 36:20, a very abbreviated account. The people who remained whenever the Babylonians came in, they hung around until it wasn't the Babylonians anymore, it was the Medes and the Persians, like we just said. So, just like the Babylonians rose up and destroyed the Assyrians, rebelled and succeeded, after enough years went by, 70 years, ironically, the Persians and the Medes rose up in a united effort, a coalition they made, and did the same thing to the Babylonians. So now the Babylonians are knocked off. For the second time in history, what we call the Babylonian Empire is actually as far as history is concerned, it's considered the Neo-Babylonian Empire because it wasn't the original Babylonian Empire. So for the second time in history, they've been squashed out. And now it's the Persians and the Medes, or initially the Medes and the Persians, but eventually they became known as the Persians and the Medes, and then eventually they became just known as the Persians because the Medes and Persians joined, and then at first the Medes had the dominant part, and then the Persians took the dominant part, and then the Medes just sort of, became known as the Persian Empire. But it was the Medes and the Persians' joint effort that took over the Babylonians. And at the end of the 70 years of captivity, the Persian king, named King Cyrus, told the Jews that they can go home. They weren't strictly speaking free, but they were allowed to leave because the Babylonians had taken them captive, like Jeremiah said, and carried them actually physically to the foreign land. They destroyed Jerusalem and took the Jews north, scattered throughout the country of Babylonia there. But King Cyrus rose up and said, this Jewish people, I'm going to allow them to go home back where they were taken from in the city that was destroyed. Well, many of the Jews did do that. Not many compared to what left, but many Jews did go back to Jerusalem. And Ezra and Nehemiah follows some of those. Ezra 1 through 6 is basically the first return, and then Ezra 7 through 10 is the second return, and then Nehemiah is the third return. But not all the Jews went back to Jerusalem. Some of them chose, for whatever reason, to stay in the country of Babylonia, or now the Persian Empire. And that is what Esther covers. Not all of it, but Esther, the person, and Esther, the book, concerns the Jews that stayed out in the foreign land. And again, we'll see a map. In fact, I'll go ahead and pop up a map just to help us a little bit. The Persian Empire, also they got a technical name. That's the name if you looked it up in history books. But this was the empire. It was the biggest empire to that point, the biggest world empire. Here's Jerusalem. Well, here is one of the capitals of Babylonia. There were multiple capitals in the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, whichever way you want to look at it. At this point, it's the Persian. Here's Babylon, the city of Babylon, which was the former capital of Babylonia. This was another capital. See, the kings, one capital apparently wasn't enough, so they had their winter capital and their summer capital, and they had their, official ceremonial capital or whatever. This is where the book of Esther takes place, in this capital, which I believe was the summer capital, don't quote me on that, of the Persian Empire. So many of the Jews that were scattered throughout all this territory somewhere in the Babylonian Empire chose to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the city, starting with the temple. Some of them stayed behind where they already had been. So you think 70 years, when it's mentioned there, it's just passed over like that. 70 years is a long time. So many of the people, once King Cyrus said the Jews can go home, well, they already were home. Because it was 70 years ago that the captivity began. So they decided that they didn't want to go back. And Esther and all the Jewish characters of the book of Esther are some of those people that stayed around that part of the country. So that is a little background. Esther it takes place about over 50 years after the Jews were allowed to return. So Cyrus says the Jews can go home. Ezra records, they went back in 3 groups, decades apart. Ezra, first part, records the first one. Ezra, the second half, records the second one. Nehemiah records the third one. And meanwhile, Esther takes place in the foreign land. Same general time period, but whereas Nehemiah, or Ezra and Nehemiah are talking about the Jewish people in Jerusalem, Esther is what's going on over in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. So, as we already pointed out, we're going to see courage, we're going to see faithfulness, we're going to see the unseen hand of God especially. But first, in this opening lesson, we're going to look at the king of the Persians at this time. Based on the text, Hebrew text, his name was Ahasuerus. But he was also known more commonly as Xerxes. And I'm going to call him Xerxes for a couple of reasons. I put Xerxes here because it fit on the screen better than the other name. So that was just strictly convenience. I'm going to call him Xerxes because it's easier to say. And so just understand, Xerxes the first is the Ahasuerus of Esther. So that was just, we're pretty familiar with the concept of people having different names, especially at that time period, maybe in that part of the world. So we're looking at the kingdom of Xerxes because he is a major player in this history, in this account, the king Xerxes. I also like referring to him as Xerxes because that's the name that he's most commonly known as, and because in the accounts of history, that's what he's going to be called. And this is a time period of Jewish history that is very much concurrent and overlapping with very popular secular history, like the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans, and the 300, and that whole, almost like a fable, that whole the historical element of it. The king of Persia at that time was Xerxes the first. That's him. This is him. So if you've ever read any accounts, and you might remember from our journeys through the Bible, we looked at some things about him. He's there. You look at history, not very flattering for him. It's kind of like Herod the Great. Not a good rap. It's his own fault. It's not unfair. I mean, it's totally just. Herod the Great was a bona fide psychopath. And Xerxes was too. So, Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 9 is our text for this lesson. It says, "Now, in the days of Xerxes, the Xerxes who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces," we'll just stop there. There's our marker, and we already teased the map a little bit. But if you don't know anything about geography, you're going to read over that and it's not going to mean anything. But it's actually a pretty big statement, because India and Ethiopia, especially by ancient standards, not close together at all. They're pretty far apart. And it may not even do it justice to see this, the way that this map is laid out. But India is all the way over here, and Ethiopia is all the way down here in Africa, the northeastern Africa. That is basically just a statement to mark the borders of the Persian Empire. And like I said, 127 provinces, yeah, that sounds like a lot. Of course, it doesn't tell us how big the provinces were, so 127 provinces could be a pretty small territory. But it wasn't. This is, like we said, the biggest stretch of the borders of a world superpower to date at this time. So, we got some context about, here's Jerusalem. The biggest that the nation of Israel ever got in David's time and Solomon's time, those borders, was only like this. up there near Damascus and down here, that is nothing compared. I mean, all that yellow that's the kingdom of Persia. Huge, massive. So already that tells us this guy obviously was powerful. There have been artifacts that have been discovered from his kingdom. Like this, that's him. You don't recognize him? That is him, I promise. His tomb has been discovered. There's his tomb. Xerxes the First, a.k.a. Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. So yeah, the history crosses over nicely. Let me go back to the text here. It says, in those days, when King Xerxes sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, so there's Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. What are we learning here? Besides, as the Old Testament is customary to do, it's just these are the facts. The writers don't give some sort of lesson or application or say, wow, commentary like, wow, that's a lie, or anything like that. It just tells us the facts. It's up to us to see what we're learning. Besides just the straight facts, we're learning that Xerxes, not only did he reign over this massive empire, but he knew his power, he liked his power, and he liked to flex and flaunt his power. And that's what he's doing. He's trying to woo people and show them, look how big and bad and powerful I am. Look at all this. 180 days? Is that necessary? If you ever hold a feast that lasts 180 days, please don't invite me, because I don't want to do that. That's a lot. Now, that's not to say that every single person there stayed there that whole time. That's unreasonable and highly unlikely that that's the way that it was. But this whole event lasted 180 days, and they probably came and went and maybe even rotated, like different nobles, groups of nobles, maybe a week at a time or however long they wanted, were invited to this. The whole point of this was Xerxes showing everybody how great Xerxes is. Quite a commendable thing, isn't it? Yeah. Look how that's what kids do, and we try to teach them, don't be like that. Nobody likes a braggart. Nobody likes people that are bragging all the time, and you say you did this one time, but you got to one-up them and say, well, yeah, I did something even more impressive. Nobody likes those people. I don't, anyway, and I can't imagine anybody that does. Xerxes was that kind of person in a typical kingly manner. Look at my greatness and my glory. 180-day feast or party. He showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. So at the feast, and by the way, to be able to rule over that big of an area, you got to have some skill. It didn't just fall into his lap. You got to have the funds and the monetary financial power, but you also got to have the political skills necessary and things like that. So that's not to say that he wasn't a cunning and crafty, skilled man in the ways that you need to be to have that sort of position, but his vices greatly outweighed his virtues, if he had any virtues. Well, what we read ended up happening at this time during this 180 days. It says, when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days, so maybe an additional special occasion near the end of that main event, that long stretching banquet. A feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Anybody want to try to describe all that in one word? Lavish, extravagant, expensive. That's not one word, Zach. I guess it's got a hyphen in it, so over hyphen the hyphen top. I'll count that as one word. Yeah. Judge says counts, okay? Yeah, over the top for sure. All of those are correct answers. That's the point. That's why this is being described. Number one, because it was a fact. Number two, what do these facts teach? What do they say? This is just pure magnificence. Spared no expense. And if you were there and you walked in, you'd have to hold your jaw up because you would be, wow, this is amazing. And that was the point. It wasn't just, wow, the slaves who built this were really talented. No, it's, wow, look at Xerxes' palace. That's how it worked. Whereas, we would probably be more likely to think the people who actually built this are the ones who deserve the credit, and rightly so. But that's not the way the world worked then, especially in this case. But we're getting impressed by the extravagance, as somebody said, okay? So it's not over, though. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict.
Did he let onto his or it says he had a feast for people great and small, so does that mean that, more people were invited?
I'm not sure. It's possible that they were allowed to come around. That may be what it means. That's usually what that euphemism means. The only question mark would be if that's supposed to be understood in the context of the people that were already invited. Maybe it means the people that were there, small and great, relatively speaking, like the big time rulers, and like the mayor to the Secretary of Defense kind of thing, that kind of idea. Or it might mean that, in theory, he would want to show it to everybody. But here's where it gets a little sketchy. As far as the drinking was concerned, he gave an edict. I was fascinated by this fact that I never considered. This, in chapter 1 here, is the only edict that Xerxes makes in the entire book that he doesn't consult with his trusty advisors. I thought that was fascinating to me. But here's what it was. And it's probably a good thing this was the only one, because this kind of gives you a little hint. Drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Apparently not just maybe limited to the drinking, but whatever they wanted to do. Yeah. What could possibly go wrong with a decree like that? We're going to have a party that's going to last, this special one at least, a whole week. This may lend itself to the conclusion that not every single person was invited, because number one, the alcohol that will flow is going to be unlimited, generally speaking. And number two, you are not to cut any one person off. And you're not going to tell them what they can and can't do. Probably the worst possible idea that anybody could ever come up with. But that was it. A royal edict from the king. There will be no restrictions on conduct and alcohol consumption. So, yeah. The people were probably thankful that they weren't invited, the ones that weren't invited. But that's maybe shows us a little bit about Xerxes. But it wasn't because he wanted everybody to be doing horrible, evil things. It was because because the lack of any restrictions on consumption just went to show even more how much he had. Because I don't know how many people were at this last week that was like the exclamation point. But even if you had 20 people or 50 people, and you're going to say there's no limit, that you would only do that if you knew absolutely for certain that there's no possibility you will run out, which that's kind of the point. He has an unlimited flow, like a waterfall of wine. It doesn't run out. Look how great he is. This guy, he's impressing them with his prowess and his greatness. Dean, do you have something? Okay. So, we also learn sort of, in addition, this sort of sets up what's going to happen next, which sorry to say, we'll have to save till next week, Lord willing. The queen, her name was Vashti, or something like that. She had a feast for the women in another of the palaces or in another part of the palace, the king's palace. We're not told why this was. Obviously, it's unimportant. Maybe we're not told why that was because that's the way they always did it, for all we know. That's a very plausible possibility, or else there would need to be an explanation. But for whatever reason, the queen and the women, presumably all the wives of the men that were there, they had their own feast. That feast, I would probably rather be at that feast, to be honest, but this is a feast going on over there. Again, there's nothing to take from this, except this is going to set up what's going to happen. The queen, if we know anything about the book of Esther, spoiler alert, close your ears now if you don't want to know, Esther becomes the queen of Persia. Well, we learn here there already is a queen of Persia. So, clearly, if you know those two things, you know something's going to happen to where there's no queen of Persia anymore. And this verse sets up the events that are about to take place. I guess not just this verse, all 9 of these verses. Here's the picture, the scene, the grandeur, all these powerful people drinking without compulsion, no limits. Every man is allowed to do as he pleases. And then we have the women over there. And the other part, probably much more civilized, dignified. I'll never get the image out of my head of when I was in 5th grade. Sorry to go here, but I'm old enough that the sex education ordeal in public schools was just starting to be flirted with at elementary school age. It did not go well, I'll tell you. Parents were very angry, and for good reason. They separated the boys and the girls to talk to us about this. And you can imagine, you get a bunch of 5th grade boys in a room, and you're going to talk to them about that. The questions, the giggling, it was the best day of the year, basically, at school, is the way. Anyway, I'll never forget, when that was over, I'll never forget the difference between when that boy's door opened and when the girl's door opened. The session was over. The boys' door opened, basically flew off the hinges like it was the last day of school. And the girls walked out like they just witnessed a funeral, or a murder even. Not a funeral, a murder. It was like that difference, not exactly that difference, but that's what I picture here. The difference in the feast of the men and the feast over in the other part of the palace with the women. And it's about to go haywire because of one request that we'll look in further detail. There's a little bit of controversy in terms of what exactly the king was telling her to do. And I'm not fully convinced that some of the more extreme suggestions are accurate. But at any rate, Xerxes decides there's one part of his kingdom that hasn't been flaunted yet, and he's going to change that. Yeah, David?
I just want to say, actually, she brought about what we call the women's liberation movement.
Yeah, she started something. Yeah, which again, not to get ahead of ourselves. I mean, we're ahead of time a little bit, but still, depending on what he was actually saying, my thought is that many commentators and scholars try to justify what she did by making what he was wanting to be something inherently vile and depraved. But as far as the text is concerned, I don't see that as. Yeah, of course, we in the 21st century can't help sometimes but to implant our own standards of society into history. So, just for instance, some people say that he was telling her to come in there naked or something like that. Again, it's not inherent in the text for sure, and I'm not so sure that would have been something that would have been expected or even done in that day. Even if people, in some parts of the world may think that's no big deal today, doesn't mean it was back then at that time. There's this weird mixture that I at least struggle to reconcile, where in some ways you go back in time and things were less vile in that way, and they're getting more so now, like the perception of physicality and such. But then at the same time, you go back in time and some things were more vile. So it's kind of, where's the line drawn and how do we balance this out? As far as the text is concerned, we don't know exactly what he was telling her to do. So it's hard for us to determine exactly whether we should applaud her or not for what she did, for refusing, spoiler again. But all we know is, at this point, the women were all together. And I can't help but think that had something to do with it. As far as the king calls you to come and do something. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Yeah, Dean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And, as far as we know, that's as far as it went. It's not that unheard of that she would say no, regardless. I can prove it right now if you want. Tabby, come here for a second. See? Told you. She said no. I try to do it all the time. Try to take my queen everywhere and show her to everybody. Okay, so applications. Vanity is a word we also could have used. It wasn't the word I was thinking of when I asked for the one-word summary, but vanity is definitely up there. It definitely applies. Vanity of, this was his world, basically. And you know what it was? A bunch of stuff. And that reminds us of something Jesus said in Luke 12. Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Or, as I like to paraphrase, life is more than your stuff. Xerxes apparently didn't think much of that. Yeah. Yeah, Solomon. Yeah. Yeah, Solomon, I mean, his kingdom was nowhere near the size, like 1/100th, or at least 1/50th of the size of Xerxes' kingdom, but that's not to say that his palace, and I mean, we know the temple was magnificent because we read about the building of it and how no expense was spared, and then whenever they rebuilt the temple around, somewhere generally around the time of Esther, some of the men that were old enough, they were weeping because it was nothing like Solomon's. See, we know that the glory was way up there, and yet Solomon concluded it's all vain, it's all vanity, because it doesn't get you anything in the end. Totally pointless. 1 Timothy 6:10, Paul said, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." Loving money does not do well for someone's spiritual well-being. And then Xerxes attempted to sway his subjects to his side through the use of alcohol. Still practiced today. It's easier to get people to do what you want them to do, isn't it? I've never been to a comedy club, but my understanding is that you have to drink there. Or at least they really want you to. You know why? Why would a comedian want you to be drinking alcohol when they're up there?
Because they're not really funny.
Yeah, because they're going to laugh at anything. And the next day they might think about it and be like, why was that funny? Because when you're under the influence, it's easier to be swayed. I remember after one of my procedures I had done, I had to take some pills. And I was watching something on TV, and I laughed harder than I've ever laughed in my entire life. And that was back in the DVR days, before everything was streaming, so I recorded it. Because I was home alone for some reason. That's my queen, left me all alone under the influence of painkillers. And I was going to show her, and I had that epiphany that why did I think this was funny? This is not funny at all. I thought it was funny the night before. Well, King Xerxes, it was going to serve his purpose to have everybody be able to drink without compulsion, because then whenever he brings up this brilliant idea, they'll be like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. Let's sign something. Because once they do that, it's over. It doesn't matter if they can't say, I didn't mean that, I was drunk. Nope. So, yeah, it's the oldest trick in the book. But smarter to remember the words of the wise man in Proverbs 23. Do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. So his conclusion on that, based on that fact, is not to be careful with it, but don't even look at it.